Africa wasn't underdeveloped because it was poor. It was made poor. Its wealth fueled Europe's rise. This is the explosive argument at the heart of Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. The book, first published in 1972, flipped the usual narrative of Africa's history. Instead of asking why Africa lagged behind Europe, Rodney asked who made Africa underdeveloped. And his answer was uncompromising: Europe, through centuries of slavery, colonialism, and economic exploitation. Dr. Walter Rodney was born in Georgetown, Guyana in 1942. From an early age, he was known as a brilliant student, winning scholarships that took him first to Jamaica and then to the University of the West Indies. He later earned his PhD in African history at SOAS in London at just 24 years old. Rodney's brilliance was matched by his activism. He taught in Tanzania and Jamaica, always bringing history into dialogue with the struggles of ordinary people. His life was cut short when he was assassinated in 1980 at the age of 38. But his work, especially his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, 1972, remains one of the most influential texts in Pan-African thought. Rodney was not the kind of scholar who stayed locked in the academy. He was a man of the people. He would leave the lecture halls and sit in the streets of Kingston, Jamaica, talking with Rastafarians, working class youth, and activists. This made him dangerous in the eyes of the establishment. In 1968, while teaching in Jamaica, Rodney was banned from re-entering the country after attending a Black Writers Conference in Montreal and speaking out against racial injustice, capitalism, and neo-colonial exploitation. This ban sparked the famous Rodney Riots in Kingston, where students, workers, and the poor flooded the streets in protest. The government responded with heavy repression, but the riots became a symbol of Rodney's influence, showing that his ideas resonated not only in lecture halls, but also in the grassroots struggles of ordinary people. The Rodney Riots marked him as a revolutionary intellectual who threatened entrenched power, and they cemented his reputation as a voice for the voiceless across the Caribbean and Africa. For Rodney, history was never abstract. It was about power, who wields it, and who suffers under it. His sharpest tool for exposing this was his groundbreaking book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Published in 1972, Rodney's book was a bombshell. It flipped the common narrative. Instead of asking why Africa was backward, he asked, who made Africa underdeveloped? His answer was direct. Europe did, through centuries of exploitation. Rodney shows that the Atlantic slave trade drained Africa of millions of its strongest people. Entire communities were destabilized. This wasn't just a human tragedy, it was an economic sabotage that stunted African societies while fueling Europe's rise. African development was blunted, and Africa's loss was Europe's gain. The two are inseparable. This was Rodney's central argument. Underdevelopment wasn't accidental. Africa's poverty and Europe's wealth are two sides of the same coin. When formal colonialism began in the 19th century, Rodney argues, it was not about civilizing Africa, but about extracting resources, cash crops, mining, forced labor, all designed to enrich Europe while locking Africa into dependency. The riches that went out of Africa did not leave Africa with a chance to develop. They left Africa underdeveloped. In other words, Europe's prosperity was financed by Africa's exploitation. And once wealth was drained, the continent was left with fragile economies designed only to serve foreign needs. Rodney also critiques the role of local collaborators, chiefs, middlemen, and later the post-independence bourgeoisie, who became intermediaries in systems of exploitation. This, he says, kept wealth concentrated in a small elite while the masses remained poor. Rodney's most important idea is that underdevelopment is not a natural state. Africa wasn't behind Europe. Rather, Europe actively underdeveloped Africa through economic exploitation, political domination, and cultural manipulation. The question is not whether Africa is underdeveloped, but how it was underdeveloped in relation to Europe. Rodney turns the question back on the world. Instead of blaming Africa, we must look at Europe's role in manufacturing this imbalance. Even though Rodney wrote in 1972, his arguments echo loudly today. Then, Africa's gold, rubber, and cotton were shipped to Europe. Now, cobalt, lithium, and oil are extracted for Europe and the global North's green transition. The pattern hasn't changed. Africa remains a supplier of raw materials rather than a producer of finished goods. 2. Unequal trade. Rodney warned that colonial economies were built on unequal exchange. Today, the European Union remains one of Africa's biggest trading partners, but African states still export raw products and import expensive manufactured goods. This imbalance continues the cycle of dependency. 3. Debt as a new chain. Colonialism may be gone, but debt has taken its place. International financial institutions, often influenced by Europe, enforce austerity and structural adjustment. This is what Rodney would call neo-colonial underdevelopment. 4. The role of elites. Rodney's critique of the national bourgeoisie feels prophetic. Many African leaders today negotiate trade and resource deals that benefit elites, but leave their populations struggling. He would argue that these elites are still acting as junior partners in Europe's enrichment. The question is not whether Africa is underdeveloped, but how it was underdeveloped in relation to Europe. Walter Rodney. Rodney encourages us to see underdevelopment as a process, not a failure of African people or culture. Consequences for African people and societies: political instability, exploitative systems, entrenched inequality, setting the stage for coups, authoritarianism, and weak institutions, psychological and cultural effects, dependency mentality, distrust in leadership, and fractured societies. Economic impact, lack of infrastructure, industrial base, or wealth accumulation in local hands. Africa was deliberately underdeveloped to serve European interests. This underdevelopment is the historical fact that shapes our present reality. Walter Rodney. Rodney's historical lens helps us understand contemporary African economic and political challenges. They are deeply rooted in centuries of systemic exploitation. The core argument is that Europe built Africa's underdevelopment through slave trade. Africa lost millions of its strongest citizens. Entire societies were destabilized. Rodney shows that this wasn't just a human tragedy, it was economic sabotage fueling Europe's wealth. African development was blunted, and Africa's loss was Europe's gain. The two are inseparable. Rodney turns conventional history on its head. Europe's rise is directly tied to Africa's impoverishment. Underdevelopment is not natural, it is manufactured. Colonial exploitation, cash crops, mining, and forced labor structured African economies to serve European needs. Industrialization was discouraged, dependency entrenched. The riches that went out of Africa did not leave Africa with a chance to develop. They left Africa underdeveloped. Local elites often mediated European interests, creating a class whose loyalty was to foreign powers rather than their people. Underdevelopment is not a pre-existing condition. It is the result of historical processes imposed by Europe. Economic consequences. Wealth transfer, skewed trade patterns, and monopolized resources left Africa with fragile extractive economies. Rodney's framework is a tool for analysis and action. It's not just history, it's a call to rethink Africa's economic and political structures today. He reminds us that underdevelopment is not inevitable, it is political. If exploitation built the modern world, then justice and solidarity can rebuild it differently. When we ask today why Africa continues to face poverty, instability, and external dependency, Rodney's answer still holds weight. Look at the structures of global power. Ask not why Africa lags, but who profits from Africa's condition? Walter Rodney's life was short, but his voice still calls out across decades. He taught us that history is a weapon, and the question is, how will we use it? On June 13th, 1980, Walter Rodney was killed by a car bomb in Georgetown, Guyana. He was just 38 years old. The bomb was reportedly handed to him by Gregory Smith, a sergeant in the Guyana Defense Force. Many believe, and later investigations strongly suggested, that Rodney's assassination was orchestrated by the government of then Prime Minister Forbes Burnham, who saw Rodney and his Working People's Alliance as a political threat. The Commission of Inquiry held decades later concluded that the state bore responsibility for his death. But whether or not every detail is known, one fact is clear. Rodney was eliminated because his ideas were too dangerous for the establishment. In the final analysis, people must be prepared to struggle for their own liberation. No one else can give it to them. Walter Rodney. These words take on a haunting meaning when we remember his death. Rodney knew the risks of his activism, and he understood that liberation could not be handed down by elites or foreign powers. It had to be fought for, and that fight would be dangerous. Rodney's killing reminds us of a pattern across Africa, the Caribbean, and the wider global South. Radical thinkers and leaders who challenge neo-colonial structures often face repression, exile, or assassination. From Patrice Lumumba to Thomas Sankara, the message has been the same. Those who call out exploitation and demand liberation risk their lives. What does this mean for contemporary African intellectuals and leaders who carry Rodney's torch? It means their work is urgent, but it also means they face real dangers in a world where power is still unevenly distributed. Speaking truth to power often comes at a high cost. Rodney's assassination was not just about silencing one man, it was about silencing a whole vision of justice. And yet, 45 years later, his words are still alive, which tells us that ideas are harder to kill than people.